questions, feel free to put them in the chat. I will be keeping an eye on it, and I'll Mark, don't feel like you have to keep an eye on it. I'll chime in if there's something that comes up that I think might be good, or a direct question. But yeah, so feel free to use the chat function there. And without further ado, take it away, Mark.
All right. Thanks for the intro, Ben. And of course, thanks for having me. It's going on to the annoying part. Yes, I did pick the most obnoxious color I could for these slides. But yeah, we're going to talk about surveys. We're going to talk about how they work. And at the end of this, we're going to show you how to make your own basic one in about an hour. Now, moving on to the obligatory who I am screen. Yep, this is me. The endless series of badges. Surprisingly, only 5-star ranger, but we're not going to talk about that. But I always feel awkward when I have to present this slide because I always end up feeling like this. You know, not a good look. Anyways, moving on to why we're really here. Survey platforms. Now, there's a lot of them. That yes, even Salesforce has one, which of course is really funny because like part of the reason when I first started making this, when I first designed this out, and like literally my first 6 months of working in the Salesforce ecosystem, Salesforce had just rolled out their own survey product, while also using Get Feedback to run their own internal surveys that they were sending out. But of course, you've seen some of these Survey Monkeys, Qualtrics, and when you have to evaluate a survey platform, something gets obfuscated because when you look at enough of them, you learn one important fact about all of them. They all pretty much are the same. They have basically the same data models, and the only real differences are on just the front end and how easy they are to use. So let's talk about the things that are just the end of the day, what a survey platform is and isn't. So on the tech side, you are going to have a data model of how to store the responses that you're getting, some way to collect those responses and put them somewhere else, right? So you can do some reporting on them or use their own internal reporting. And that's actually when you're evaluating survey platforms where you're going to find a lot of differentiation is how much reporting tooling is in it already. Like for example, Qualtrics, using it from a perspective of actually building out surveys from as a marketer perspective or as a designer, you're going to notice it's going to be lacking a lot of features. I recently had the fight with Qualtrics not too long ago to get some surveys up, and it works, but not the most user friendly. Whereas comparison to something like Get Feedback, which is very design focused, very user friendly, all that. But at the end of the day, they're all doing the same thing. You're asking questions and you're collecting answers, and that's like that. The design is where you're really going to get in there. And this is also one thing I would mention out is something that some of these survey platforms can help you with. Because I'm not going to beat up on survey platforms too much on this presentation because there are valid reasons to have them. Even though we're going to talk about how to build one, I do not actually recommend doing this because you'll run into the limits of it relatively quickly. And sometimes those limits kind of matter and they're not great ways around them. Pardot, or if you can even extend this out to Marketing Cloud Core if you really wanted to using a data extension instead of Pardot, but we'll talk about that later. But yeah, you can run into limitations. So this is not a recommended use case that we're going to talk about later, but understanding how surveys work and just that core functionality will help you evaluate whether or not you should build one your own or you look into using one of these third-party vendors. But of course, the main thing that's going to be the big driving point for it is whether or not the core stakeholder in your organization who needs to be creating these surveys can create them themselves. Now let's move on to, again, like this is just what the basic data model is going to look like in pretty much every survey platform you're going to see. You're going to have your survey response object somewhere in the middle that's going to look out to a person and an organization. Sometimes there'll be a third object where there'll be the surveys themselves and then the responses to that survey, which also have those responses, which then links back up here. So if you want to put that fourth model in there, it'd be a straight line between the object in the middle and the survey response and the survey itself. So something like that. But this is just the core data model. And pretty much every commercial survey product you're going to see is going to use a pretty similar data model. And it's actually what when we talk about a little bit later when we get into the build, you'll be building out more or less the same actual data model that's going to come in these managed packages that you will see from survey providers. But yeah, it's not a complicated data model. You're not doing some lookups here. I I designed this out using lookups because that's honestly the way most of these commercial ones do it. You can do it with a master detail object, but I actually don't recommend it because it does create some weirdness on the sharing and visibility front. Now, just general like best practices for your keeping your surveys. The best of all is also just keep it simple. Like think back to the last time you filled out a survey. What point did you think about bailing? Was it around question 4? Because if you have more than 4 questions on a survey, you're not going to get a lot of responses. Now, this is like a trap a lot of marketers fall into when we're building out surveys, and not just marketers, of course, also our executive stakeholders is they believe in their customers care about their product as much as they do, which is usually not going to be the case. It's because they like we get sent surveys all the time. We get sent we're marketers. Our inboxes get hit just as hard as everyone else's, and we ignore 90% of those emails that come in just like everyone else does. Now, it's not personal, it's just the way it is. So just remember, like, be very focused on what you want to ask and have realistic expectations. And since we're in an election year, this is a good way to point out just the thing always have to talk to people about when we're building out surveys is just bad questions will get bad data. Just by the way you ask a question can influence the answers you're going to get. As I mentioned, election years, every time there's an election, you'll see 2 or 3 articles about this where candidate A's policies are popular, but candidate A themselves is not popular. You look back over the years, you'll see hundreds of articles going on about this where if we just describe what the policies are versus do you support candidate A's policies, you see very widely different results in the polling. So that's just one basic way of framing it because you're hitting into the polarization of the person rather than what they actually think about the topics and the politics or even the purpose. So when you're designing out surveys, it is very important to do a bias check, evaluate what you're doing, and of course, understand your audience, understand how your audience is going to perceive the questions that they're being asked. Because that's going to be the thing that's going to get you the best information. Because you want to make surveys are scary because you kind of have to be vulnerable because you're asking people to tell you what they think, and what they think may not be what you want to hear. So you have to be willing to get a bad answer, and you want to make sure that you're not steering your participants into getting you information that's not going to be useful, or you're just going to create a metric that your stakeholders care about, which will make them happy, but not actually improve the product or advance any of the goals we care about by generating these surveys. Now, on surveys in the data model, we'll talk about this a little bit more as we go on, but there's 2 special questions that you'll see all the time. Like they're going to be like, how likely are you to recommend this product to a friend, or some variation of that, or how would you rate this experience? You get these all the time. There's 2 special categories on these, and I call these out specially because on the survey data models themselves, they actually do get saved as a special field for a specific reason. Like first one, of course, is the CSAT, which is just usually a 1 to 5, like how'd we do? And of course, and the same thing with the net promoter, how likely you are to recommend, which is usually 1 to 10. Don't ask me why the industry has decided that's what the scales are. It's just that's what everyone does. So we all kind of follow that. Now, when you set up your surveys, you want to make sure whatever scale you set up, either 1 to 5, 1 to 10 on either your CSAT or your NPS, you keep the same scale the entire time you're ever running surveys. Because the reason why you save these on a separate field is because you're not going to ask the CSAT question as question 3 on every survey you're going to ask. So you want to make sure you duplicate that question response into a separate number field. So that way you can track it over time, do aggregates, and just do math on it a lot easier than if it's just remembering. Well, on the first survey, we said it was question 5. Second one, it was question 2. It was only question 1 on survey 3. So you want to make sure these 2 metrics are the easiest way to report them as possible. So just keep that in mind. And when you do start building out your surveys, make a conscious choice to decide what's the scale you're going to use for the NPS and your CSATs, and how often you're going to distribute them, and what metrics you want to track that over time or in aggregate. Of course, now that we got through some of the housekeeping, I also got to call this out about CSATs and NPS scores. As I mentioned, like earlier, we may care about our product more than our customers do. Asking a bad question will get you a bad answer. Like right here, we always see in this Microsoft one. Do you ask us an NPS question on a product that no human has a normal conversation about? they're going to get a lot of ones, and you can't take so understanding why you're getting information, what question you're asking, can a lot of times influence why you're getting the information you're getting. So now with all that out of the way, let's roll up our sleeves and do something. All right, so on this is going to be two fronts. On the Salesforce side, you got a one-time setup where we're going to build out a data model, build out some fields, and make the automation that makes the whole thing work. On the Pardot side, we're just going to connect the dots, sync up our fields, make up a form to make the whole thing function. So of course, the first step is our data model. We're going to start off with a survey response object similar to the one I showed you in that screenshot above. Use the auto number instead of a name field. So that way you just have survey response 001 through whatever as these go on, because not every survey is going to be for the same survey campaign. And this way you can use a separate name field to track and group the surveys by just like what the name of that survey is. So like they would be like your onboarding survey, something like that way you can track them and then keep internal things separate. You got your lookup, your account and contact lookup, so you can link those up to an account, to the customer account and the contact you filled it out. Or if you want to be fancy and even include pre-registered prospects, you'd want to throw this in on lead as well. But I just built this out using contacts just because it's faster. And as I mentioned above, you make a couple number fields for your NPS and CSAT scores. No decimal places because whole numbers are nothing, right? And this one's going to sound silly. You're just going to make a bunch of generic text fields, numbered. I just did 1 to 5. You can do more, but the more you do, the more you're going to run into. Now, of course, that question's 1 to 5, answers 1 to 5 that way. And I'll talk more about why we did it that way. And then you're going to make some mirroring fields on your contact. So this is something that we can have Pardot link into to pass this data back and forth. And of course, I got to mention, make sure the API user has access to all these fields, because otherwise you're going to have a bad time when you get into the Pardot steps. Now, next thing is we're going to do build a flow. You see two screenshots here with Jordy disapproving of one and approving of the other. The one I'm going to talk about more is the one Jordy likes, which is the nice, clean, simple single create node, single cleanup node. You can do it what is the best practices recommended way, which is the one Jordy doesn't like up there, where you use the decision node, which I'll talk about a little bit later, to filter out based on question responses. And this is mostly just to get around a very funny Pardot limitation that I'll talk a little bit more later. But let's go under the hood. On your triggering node, you're going to look for just last survey day completed. So just some field that you're going to put, one of those fields that we talked about putting on the contact. This is something that gets populated by Pardot when the date was the date field of whenever someone completes a survey. And we're going to make sure it's changed and not null. So that way we just know that a new survey came in and it didn't get changed to blank. Again, pretty standard. It's going to be an actions and related records update, because in Flow, you're not going to be able to use the fast field updates for this because we will be working with records outside your triggering object. Now, here's where some of the magic happens. In that streamlined version of the flow, you notice I'm not referencing many fields on this object. I am actually using some formula fields here for the answers and questions and the CSAT fields. Of course, on things like account and contact, we can directly reference the field values. But this is just to map out something, because I think I left it off the slide and forgot to talk about it. But one thing that's going to be very important in this is a field on the survey, on the contact, for a total number of questions. So that way, when you put it, that's going to be something we're going to populate in Pardot when we get to the form, just so that when you submit a form, we know how many questions were on it, so we only copy over the right ones. Now I'm going to show you what these formula fields I put in here are, which again, it looks scary, but it will make a little bit more sense. So on these question and answer fields, here's my example of the formula, where basically if the total number of questions is more than whatever number of that question is. So like you look at my little formula here, I have like for this one, for the formula for question 1, I just had, is the number greater than 1? Cool. You can use that. You can use whatever the answer was there. If it's less than, this way. So that way, if like, for example, the total number of surveys was 2 on question 1, we would use it. But if it's 3 more, you can see how this would work out. Looks a little bit confusing, but we're just using just using formula functions. So that way, instead of having to have multiple create nodes for each variation of how many questions could possibly be on the survey, you're just using one create node, so it's just easier to manage. You just make up your formulas, pass them on. And it's kind of the same thing for NPS, except for instead of using the number of questions, we're just looking for, is there an NPS value greater than 0? And if there is one, we use that. Otherwise, we just leave it blank on the survey response object. Now, this is the part where it gets weird because you want to make sure this is repeatable and you can use it again. Now, this is something that's not going to show up in any of your certification exams, and you will only run into this if something really bad has ever happened to you. But in Pardot specifically, was the way synced fields behavior works, you can't actually blank out a field value in one platform ever. Because no matter what the sync behavior is, whether it's Salesforce wins, Pardot wins, last updated, does not matter. If one side of that equation is blank, the populated value will always win. So I can't just, after every survey has been collected, null out our collection fields on the contact to get it ready for the next one. So that's why I have a step here where we put in just some placeholder values, reset the survey CSAT value and NPS values to 0. Again, just because those are numbers and I can't put a placeholder value there. So this way, in case you know that your survey automation worked, and more importantly, when the next survey comes in, you're preventing previous survey data from polluting your next survey. Now, I just put in captured here just as a basic example, setting it all to the same word. So this way, it's something that's not going to be you're going to see in your survey responses. So in the event that somehow one of these placeholder values ends up in your survey responses, you can also identify it as an outlier right away. Now, unfortunately, like Pardot won't let you clear this out unless you clear it again on both platforms simultaneously within the same sync window, which is not a fun process. So if you ever have a situation where you do need where some bad data gets into one platform and is now propagating to the other, it is kind of hard to fix. So be aware of that and be thankful if you've never had to run into that very weird sync behavior problem. But that's the automation that's going to power this whole thing. It's just a simple collection on the contact. The Pardot fields that we'll talk about in a second, they're going to sync into it, push the data from the form in, and then Salesforce picks it up, creates our survey response record, resets the values for the next one, and just moves on. Now, of course, Pardot setup, actually pretty easy. Again, thing we already know, we just sync those contact fields we already made. So that way we can pop those in, and then we start building a form. Landing pages, not going to talk about that too much because we're all marketers. We all know what landing pages are and how to use them. The form is the thing you're going to want to use. You can make yourself a form template or spin up a new one every time, but a template's going to be a good idea because there's some specific things you're going to want to do on the form. So like, for example, like as I mentioned, the answers 1 through X. Hey, Kelly, haven't actually seen that. I've never actually got that field to work. I'm remembering the last time, very recently, when I ran into the null value problem, I had to fight with it forever. So it's probably safer just to rely on the other thing. If you got that working, great. And for the people who weren't looking on the chat or on the recording, Kelly asked a question about enabling values to overwrite with empty null values. I personally have not actually tried that feature. Can someone remind me when that was dropped in? Because I'd never actually run into it myself. But again, just be aware of that. Be aware of the null values cause a problem. You'll have to test it out with the that functionality, or be prepared to keep values in sync. But great question. But yes, as I mentioned back on the form, you're going to want to use your answers 1 through how many questions are going to be on the survey. Those are going to be your inputs. So that way we're just going to collect the inputs. And you're going to want to throw an email field on there just to make sure you're syncing up the prospect. And you can conditionally hide it if it's auto-populated, because we're probably going to be distributing these through emails to known prospects, because an open form probably not going to be a great use of this. Now, the completion actions is where the magic's going to happen here. For the corresponding questions to go along with your answers, you're going to put in the actual question that was asked. And this is just to make sure your survey responses are going to be readable. Because that way, if you just get a response object that just has answers 1 to 5 with no context, You can use it for like reporting, but if you just want to go back in time, look back at like surveys from a couple years ago, it's important to know what questions they were asked that also produce the answers you're looking at. So that's why those question fields are there, just so you can track them. In your also that survey name, just whatever the survey name is going to be for the specific engagement that we're running, like for example, like onboarding 2024, like Q2 wrap up surveys, kind of thing. That way, so just when you run your reports, you have something to filter, so you're getting only the specific things you care about in that one report. And of course, if there is an NPS value corresponding to one of your questions, make sure that that value is also going to get mapped in your forms. Excuse me, in your forms completion actions to that corresponding NPS field as a number. So that way, when we look back at the responses, we can again do those aggregate calculations. And of course, we're going to set that survey last completed date to the day, and the survey total questions asked to just how many question fields were on the survey themselves, and that's going to power that other half that I showed you earlier in the flow. Now I didn't call this out, but I should have called this out earlier in the slides. But when you're building out the fields on contact, probably a good idea to also do something like a name prefix like survey dash so that way when someone's looking at the record, they know that these are fields related to the surveys functionality. Now, something about the form that's just going to make this work a little bit better for you. Make sure all the fields are required, and ideally either going to be something like a pick list field or not a or like a pick list or a bubble selector, something that generates a specific value every time. I know people are going to want to say like put in some free text fields to collect people's thoughts. The problem with free text fields on surveys is unless you have a human reading every single response, you're not going to get much data out of them because you can't really do reports on them. You can't do you can't really aggregate them. You physically have to have a human look at it. And that's like if you're running something small scale, which you may be doing for if you're going to try and build your own survey platform using some pieces of Pardot here. That's going to be a reasonable assumption sometimes, but you're going to remember, like if you have that free text, someone's going to read it. And if you don't have a plan for someone to be reading those responses and then having that person empowered to take action from them, the free text field's not going to generate you some usable data. So make sure your fields are pick list fields. Make sure they're also required as well in this, so that way that you don't get that placeholder data slipping in. So you have someone actually making a choice on each field. So we're collecting some data. And as I mentioned, you want to keep your distribution limited to people who are already in Salesforce, you're already known customers, because survey form, there's been something that's been learned time and time again from the internet. The more survey, if you have an open exposed survey just hanging out on the internet, or anyone can fill it out. Anyone can fill it out, and you're going to get a lot of garbage responses. So just making sure you're distributing to an audience you know has information you want to get from them, and could be reasonably expected to have something you care about to say. Now,
Hey,
should you
Mark.
want to? Sorry, Ben.
Sorry, 1 second. There was a question. I don't know if you got it. Kelly Ames
Yes.
asked, what about
The
enabling
overriding
override?
values?
Yeah.
I did throw it aside there. It was a great question, but yeah, it's good
Okay,
to call it
good.
out. Kelly did ask about like overriding account engagement values with Salesforce empty values. I personally have not actually used that feature. I like if someone has like the notes in front of me can tell me which release it was in, because I had not seen it in a release note. So if that's there and it works, great. Otherwise, but it's like in my experience with Pardot, I've not actually used it, so I can't give you firm recommendations on how well it functions. All right, now where I was talking about distribution. Yeah. As I was mentioning, just make sure you're distributing to your known prospects, because again, having an open survey form, people think it's a good idea, and then they see the data come through and then regret every decision they've ever made in their life leading up to that point. Want to make sure you're sending your surveys to, again, people who reasonably you know about. And one advantage of sending into known prospects is it's easier to link their responses up to accounts, contacts, so then you can take actionable measures against them. For example, like if someone puts in a low CSAT score, or an account has a low CSAT score over time, that can make them a target for some better, from enhanced sales outreach, so maybe an executive touch point. Just some way, something you use that. But if you are going to And as I mentioned earlier, if you're going to distribute out the leads, you will have to replicate the flow that I showed over for contact as well onto the lead object as well, doing similar things, same basic data model. You would just add a lookup to lead onto the survey response object like we showed, and make sure the matching fields are up there. Again, using the same API names that we use on the contact one, so we can get that universal sync going in Pardot. But yeah, the whole build time, once you have your plan already built out to actually get this up and running, build it and tested, about 30 minutes. The only reason I didn't have some Pardot screenshots in there is because I don't currently have access to a Pardot.org, but that's kind of just everything you need to know. And of course, some like weird things that can happen with this design. It's not perfect because again, Pardot was not designed to do this. So because we're using that one per day, you can only really capture the in that flow I use is using a change on the last submitted date as the trigger. You can use other fields to trigger it, but it might be the same, might create the same problem just in a different way. For example, like if someone submits out the same survey twice in one day and you're only using change in survey name, that second submission wouldn't trigger the automation because the survey name would remain the same. But again, play around with, if you're going to do this, like think about like what your triggering condition is going to be. I use date just because it's most likely to change whenever there's going to be one. But of course, there's going to be that differential because you can't really reset the date because that would also trigger a recursive loop with the automation. But that's going to get a little too deep into the weeds. But yeah, it's mentioned, and of course mentioned, you're going to run into some edges on this because Pardot's not really designed to do this. So we are pushing the edges of what's allowed in the platform. Now, again, mentioned earlier, like a known set of prospects works best. So that way you already have like a good distribution model built up, and you're going to have records to sync those responses back to in a consistent way. And of course, like on the design front, if you've worked as Pardot forms, you know what you can and cannot do with those. So that's going to, of course, impact how dynamic your surveys are going to be. But as I mentioned before, you want to keep your surveys quick, small, and actionable. Like then you're asking more than 4 questions, you're going to start seeing a drop off in just response rates because I think back about the last time you filled out a survey. Unless they were giving you something for it or something that was a really important thing, you're probably just ignoring the email altogether. Or if you are going to get in and you get to around question 3, it's when you bounce because it's just not worth your time anymore. So just have some empathy for your recipients and just respect their time. And of
All
course,
right. So, sorry, go ahead.
that's just that last call out Ben mentioned earlier, but just be wary about the placeholder data that is slipping into your responses because that can happen just with the way some of the flow works. So, and if you do see that slip in, you're just gonna make sure to like look in to make sure your responses you have required values or something weird isn't happening there. But I think Ben was gonna jump in with a question, but that's all I got.
Yeah, no, thanks for that. That's thanks for doing this. That was great. It's one of those things where as you know, I mean, and you mentioned it at the top, there's a lot of there are a lot of solutions out there that exist, a lot of tools that you can plug in, a lot of licenses that you can buy, and that if you don't have to, if you've got some, whether yourself or you've got someone on your team who can help you build something like this without having to add to your costs, like budget costs, then that would obviously be the way forward. There's real limit. There's limiters. In fact, there's limiters in places. As you mentioned, it doesn't exactly. It doesn't sound like it's like the most scalable solution. It kind of can. It can fit like a couple of use cases very well.
Yeah, that's kind of, yeah, as I mentioned, like when I built this out, this was in like again my first 6 months in the Salesforce ecosystem, was a very scrappy org. Like we're talking full on boiler room sales. At that time, I was the sole Salesforce resource. I was the sole marketing marketing automation. I was the admin and the marketer for the sales org. So we were fighting for every dollar and spending more money on like get feedback because these survey providers, they're not cheap. No. Like even at a small business scale, if you're already springing for Pardot, which again is already also not cheap.
Mm-hmm.
It's like this, like especially like that small, like you're that small org where you are scrapping and fighting for every dollar. It's worth it to try it out, because a lot of times what also happens with surveys is they spend a lot of money onboarding a new partner, getting this in there. You run 2 surveys, you don't really have a plan, you're not thinking about it, and you end up renewing this lot, and this just comes like your gym membership. You used it twice and then never used it again, and then wonder why you keep paying for it every renewal.
Yeah. No, you're exactly. And this is one of those things where I could see a scenario where you, let's say as a company, surveys play there is a recurring need for surveys. And if you can build what this might be considered like an MVP of here's what it does, and then over time learn more and enhance it, and it becomes kind of a homegrown, but like not homegrown in a bad way. Like often that's like it's kind of a pejorative term. Is often it's like my homegrown CRM. This would be like a homegrown, entirely bespoke survey tool that you don't have to try to get on a phone with sales, like a sales technology person to figure out why this specific use case isn't working. It's because the managed package wasn't meant to do that.
That's also like the other thing, like when I mentioned evaluating survey providers, one of the biggest things you can get from them is the problem. Is like that problem of just they all want to do a very specific thing that's 98% the same as every other thing in their competitors' market. For example, like Qualtrics, I called out, like their main selling point is their built-in business intelligence. But if you already have if you're in a sophisticated org that already has like a good data science team, all those extra features of Qualtrics, not really worth it to you. And when you think about, look at it from the UI perspective, especially for your marketers who are going to be making that survey, if they can't work or do what they want to do, which Qualtrics is pretty limited in, maybe not be the use case for you. You might want to look something to get feedback where it may not have those data analytics for you, but also has that ease of use.
Yeah. One thing that when I have people who come on and they present like their like solutions that they built or things that they kind of rolled together to meet a specific requirement or need is when you were building this and then when you were kind of revisiting this, did anything either pleasantly surprise you about the end result and the process, or were you surprised that a certain thing that you expected to work a certain way did not?
Yeah, especially like when the first time I built this, because again, also I mentioned like first 6 months out of this, barely knew how Pardot was, but just had to make it work. I made a very big mistake when I built this out, where I had the field labels actually correspond to specific survey questions, which was a nightmare. Then it meant every time we wanted to add a new question to a survey, I had to make a whole new field in Salesforce, sync it over. Terrible idea. Just absolutely terrible idea. So that's why we did that. And also I didn't even utilize the survey response object. I just had them recorded as raw field values and just tracking the most recent survey. Again, terrible idea. So what you're seeing is me coming back with all my years of experience at judging one of my very early projects and judging it kind of harshly, but figuring out a way to make the same core idea work.
Okay. Cool. All right. Well, I don't have any other questions. I appreciate you doing this. Laura is currently using Pardot forms, Pardot only fields, and form notifications, then inputting into a spreadsheet. So she's gonna try this out.
That's actually like a perfect example of like migrating one of these over, was like just that extra step, just making your catch fields onto your on your contact and your lead objects, making sure your forms are still linked up to the to your prospects. But yeah, if you're getting good, this is like that would be a good step closer for you. Then you can just close the loop. No need to use the import to the spreadsheet, and just keep an eye on your forms, watch what's going on, and then also you get the advantage of using Salesforce reporting, so that way you can track things like NPS score and CSAT score over time, which is one of the big core functionalities that you're going to want to put into any survey response as a separate object, so you get those historical points.
Excellent. Okay, well, there is one, and it just occurs to me that since this is obviously like a marketing audience, have you, or did you, or have you considered I guess integrating or taking the data that you're collecting from these forms and adding them, let's say, to a campaign as a member of a campaign?
Yeah, you absolutely can. That's also part of like the form completion actions. That's also a good step to do that, is also add them into a separate campaign so you can do some remarketing to them later, just
Okay.
having them in there. I just showed off just the basic core functionality, but of course you can always spice it up. You're probably going to want to keep those campaigns up there, even just to do some revenue tracking, or you're just, again, we're all marketers and we all care about targeting. So adding in that, add the campaign member as part of the completion step is the fastest way to do it. And of course, we have
Okay.
those handy dandy link campaigns. As I
Mm-hmm.
mentioned also earlier, this same data model structure can kind of work with Marketing Cloud if you just change over the async fields over to a sync data extension. Same basic structure is going to work, because you just think about it from the perspective of, you have a form that that can collect information, and then that information can be put onto a lead or a contact in Salesforce. As long as you have that integration, that the rest of it's going to work. As long as you can
Yeah.
consistently put in that information from your form catcher into Salesforce. So it doesn't even have to be Pardot. It just has to be something you can build forms that has an integration into Salesforce, and that can hit these fields.
Excellent. All right. Well, I don't have any more questions, and I don't see any more in the chat. So thank you, Mark. You have an open invitation if you want to come back again and do a demonstration of some other cool thing that you've come across, some other use case. That's kind of what this group is for. I try to have people on who, whether it's myself or others who have kind of solved a problem, or built some kind of solution that helped them and they think could help others. So I think this is exactly that, and I appreciate you reaching out and suggesting this. And you're welcome to come back anytime you want.
Well, thanks, Ben. Thanks for having me. Great meeting everyone. I haven't done many meetings on the East Coast, but always glad to be here. And I do apologize for talking kind of quickly. We do it a little bit faster on the West Coast.
That's funny. That's good. All right. Well, yeah, I'm gonna send this out to people via email who RSVP'd, and then it'll go up on the Pardot Geeks blog and on YouTube and the meeting as well. So keep an eye out for that. The next meeting is in April, I believe, when I'm going to be kind of doing a deep dive on scoring categories, what they are, how they work, what they're things that you may not know about, things that the use cases, just kind of a live workshop, if you will. So more are being planned for the rest of the year. So keep an eye out for those as well. But again, thank you for joining, and thanks again, Mark, for taking the time. And see you guys next time.
Cool. Thanks for having me. Happy trails, everyone.